So now with the number in front of x, it tells you how many times you're going to see the sine graph between 0 and 2 pi. I'm going to see this graph 2 times between 0 and 2 pi. That means that they're evenly spaced. That means that one cycle or one graph is going to finish by pi. So it's shoving it into a smaller area. So now we need to start at 0 and we need to end at 0. Now remember the sine graph goes 0, 1, 0, negative 1, 0. So we're starting at 0, we're ending at 0, but over here at pi. So if we're moving it over, then we have to go from 0 to 1 to 0 to negative 1 to 0. It's going to be at 0 for pi over 2. And halfway in between 0 and pi over 2, which is pi over 4 or 45 degrees, it's going to go to 1. And halfway between pi and 3 pi, it's going to go to negative 1. So that one cycle finishes by pi. Now, if I only ask you to draw one cycle, you're done, and you would label this as being pi here. So that you can see, actually, if I graph all the way to 2 pi, that you're seeing two of the sine graphs between 0 and 2 pi. The period is going to be pi now, because you're finishing one cycle by pi. And of course, I could always do the same thing on the other side. I could go to negative 1 halfway in between, then positive 1 and 0, then negative 1, 0, positive 1 and 0, so that even on the other side of the y-axis, I'm seeing two of the graphs between 0 and negative 2 pi. So now if you're reading the number in front of x, it says you're only going to see half of the sine graph between 0 and 2 pi. You're only going to see half of it. You're only going to see this much. So we're spreading it out rather than shoving it in like the last problem was. So we're going from 0 to halfway in between, which is pi, having a value of 1, to 0. So we're spreading it out. That's only half of the sine graph between 0 and 2 pi. And on the other side, we would be going to negative 1, and then back up to 0. A smooth, continuous curve. So now if I wanted to graph y equals 3 sine 1/2 x, now it's still going to be half of the sine graph, but now it has an amplitude of 3 instead of an amplitude of 1. Okay, now I want to take a look at graphing y equals cosine 3x. 3 in front of x means you're going to see 3 of the cosine graphs between 0 and 2 pi. So where does one of them finish? So if I take 2 pi and I divide it into thirds, then one of these graphs has to be finished by 2 pi over 3. And then 2 pi over 3 again would take you to 4 pi over 3. And then 2 pi over 3 again would take you to 6 pi over 3, which is 2 pi. So now I'm not using the same scale. I'm using a scale here a little bit different because it's going to be a little bit easier to graph. So now I know that the cosine curve begins at 1 unless I change the amplitude. So it's going to begin at 1 to 0 to negative 1 to 0 to 1. So if I only ask you for one complete cycle, it would be done by 2 pi over 3. And then I could always repeat the second one and the third one, so that you see 3 of them between 0 and 2 pi, and of course I could always graph on the other side of the y-axis as well. Now if I'm only seeing 1/3 of the graph by 2 pi, it's taking 2 pi and dividing it by 1/3, which when I divide by the fraction, I flip it over and have 2 pi times 3. That is, one of the complete cosine graphs is going to be finished by 6 pi. So I want to divide this, or I could just divide it into 4 parts here, ending at 6 pi. And it has, the first one, has an amplitude of 1. So it's going to go from 1 to 0 to -1 to 0 to 6 pi. Because you're only seeing 1/3 of it finished by 2 pi. If I then want to have a -2 cosine 1/3 x, this is going to start at -2, and it's going to go to 0 to +2 to 0 to -2 for graphing that one and this one.